A big, big welcome back to our listeners and viewers of the Responsible Edge podcast, brought to you by the Anti-Greenwash Charter. This morning, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Mark Goyder. Mark, thank you so much for giving up some of your time this Friday morning for joining us for a show. I know we've had a few technical issues, a little bit of behind the scenes stuff going on, but it's absolutely fantastic to finally have you on the show.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Excellent stuff. Excellent stuff. Now, Mark, we have 20 minutes to talk about you and your background. And for those that aren't aware of the things that you've done in your career, to give them a real flavor as to the things that you've done and the experience that you had. I know that 20 minutes is going to be tricky for us to fill, for us to not give everything the due diligence that it really should in terms of the things that you've done. But start wherever you like. Some of our guests really do go back to kind of those formative childhood or, experiences as a young person that kind of shaped your worldview. I think those are always quite interesting to hear, especially from somebody like yourself. But just give our listeners and viewers that don't know you a bit of a flavor of your background.
Thank you very much. I'm the youngest of 8 children. I'm the product of a very happy childhood. It's not really very useful to recommend it now, but I do recommend being the youngest of a large family to anybody, because it's your older siblings who fight all the battles, and you end up being the one who gets the peace dividend, and
creates the nice clear runway.
Yes, indeed, indeed. My parents were both, in their different ways, a huge influence on me. My mother had Quaker origins. My mother was an extraordinarily tranquil person, which was probably a very good thing if you're going to parent 8 children. The first few of them during the Second World War, of course, and born during the Second World War. My father, a very passionate campaigner for responsible business decades before you and I are talking about it, and somebody of very strong commitments, a strong Christian, somebody who a great campaigner, and capable when you were on the wrong side of the argument of being quite a difficult person to deal with, and that's where my mother's diplomatic skills often came into play. Sent away to school, pretty much hated school, turned into a radical Marxist by the experience of going to boarding school, where I observed racism and anti-Semitism and elitism, which I disliked. Fortunate enough to encounter while at school a wonderful man called Alec Dixon, who was the founder of VSO, Voluntary Service Overseas, and Community Service Volunteers. And before I got a place to go to Cambridge, before I went there, I was able to volunteer for Community Service Volunteers. And an absolutely formative experience where suddenly you're going from being basically an academic product injected with knowledge and busy passing exams, and suddenly being turned into somebody who is in an everyday community up in Shropshire with a job to do, to involve local school youngsters in community service, and working particularly with the Punjabi community in that part of Shropshire. And a complete change in my sense of myself and my potential. I suddenly found I could organize things. I could communicate. I could persuade people to do things. And when I went on to university, I got quite frustrated at first, because I was back in the academic world where one analyzed and wanted to do. So I persuaded Nixon to send me back to do another dose of community service in my first summer vacation from Cambridge, and he sent me to Borstal. He sent me to a young offenders institution. It was an open Borstal. They were offenders who stolen lots of cars rather than stabbed people. And I felt they were very much like me, except they'd had a different start in life. And all of that experience, which I've talked about at some length, was so important to me because it taught me that if one wants to make the most of what you're being given in education, you have to have some experiences to relate it to. And it all circles round to what today I've been doing in the latest generation of the work of Tomorrow's Company, which I founded, which is getting into secondary school and starting to give youngsters a sense of themselves and of the world of work and of the values that they might bring to whatever they want to do in their lives. So after leaving university, I went on to try various things, including working for a trade union. In fact, the only time in my life I've ever been on strike, ironically, was while I was working for a trade union. And that's another story. And I then decided, having worked in a trade union, I wanted to work on the shop floor. And I spent 3 months working in a saw making factory without admitting I was a university graduate, just to see what it was like. And finally, I landed in a job in HR in an engineering company, the old GEC. Lewisham. I spent 5 years in that company. I didn't really like being in HR. I likened it to being a traffic warden, telling other people where they should park, and I quite wanted to drive the vehicles myself. So I then went to. I got a job as an HR manager in a large paper mill in Kent, but with the understanding when I joined them that I wanted to move on from that to general management, and I achieved that ambition. I became a manager of a production unit there, where I understood none of the technology, and the only success I had was because I knew how to communicate, and it was extraordinary how far you can get just sharing the objectives and the progress with people and listening to people. You can get quite a long way without technical knowledge and with a good team. Then politics came into it because I'm now in my late 20s, and I've always been a sleepy member of the Labour Party, and along comes the SDP, an attempt to kind of reinvigorate the centre left with new ideas and a commitment to proportional representation and a strong commitment to Europe. And I really, really was enthused by that. And we then started running 2 careers in parallel, which turned out to be, in many ways, a great mistake.
And just before we go, Mark, that was an absolutely sensational introduction to the kind of formative development of your thinking and of your worldview, and then how that manifested and played out throughout the kind of early part of your experience. So thank you for that. I'm sure our listeners were really fascinated by those timelines of events, and that's fascinating to pick out that sense of frustration that you felt within the educational system, getting a taste of the more practical experience and having an impact, and then having to go back in to the educational, higher educational system to finish things off at Cambridge. You're going to come on to talk about politics in a moment, and sort of that next phase of your career where you have those 2 careers kind of operating side by side. But what would be if you think about that sort of 20-something-year-old Mark that was having this experience of working, doing volunteering and community service, etc. If you were to now sort of tell them about what you ended up then doing throughout the rest of your career, what do you think the 20-year-old Mark would have thought of what you've done?
Wow. I think he would have thought that I had compromised in some ways, which of course we all do. I think at the stage when that late 20s, I think the early 20s Mark was pretty preoccupied with politics and achieving change through politics. And I think the early 20s, Mark, would have been curious about why I had deflected from that. I think the late 20s, Mark, would have said, feeling this kind of divergent pull in different directions between putting all the energies into the uncertain world of politics and watching contemporaries of mine doing MBAs and going on to sort of top management positions, it might have said you had to make up your mind. And I see you never did really make up your mind, and maybe this is more a reflection of the 70-year-old Mark on it all, which is, no, that's right. Both the strengths and the weaknesses of the way I've lived my working life is I've never really been able to specialize and stay in one channel. I've always been fascinated by the links and connections between the channels, and I've always fought against the compartmentalization in thinking and in organization that we see all around us. But I'm now cheating because I'm now talking about my perspective today.
You were mentioning, the late 20s Mark who decides to sort of develop these parallel careers, if you like. Just talk us through kind of what happens sort of next from that point onwards.
Oh, I didn't realize it at the time, although my wonderful wife tells me she was busy trying to tell me at the time that there was a price to be paid for throwing all your energies into helping this new political party that had started on the ground in the place where you were living, and standing for Parliament twice, getting elected to Kent County Council once, becoming deputy leader of the group on the Kent County Council, and getting involved with all the issues about the building of the Channel Tunnel rail link, which was going on at the time, and fighting general elections in 83, which felt very hopeful, and 87, which felt even more hopeful, and then discovering you had made almost zero progress in votes between 83 and 87 after 4 years absolutely pounding the streets and battering the local papers with your press releases and battering every department of local government and central government with your casework. That was a moment where something happened, which was I made one move which didn't work out well. I moved into working as the sales and marketing director in a printing company. You can't sell printing to people if you really can't talk the details of the technology as it was then.
Mark, sorry, I'm going to interrupt you there. I'm tempted not to interrupt you because you have such a brilliant way of talking this through. But a couple of questions. You had that experience in your political career, as you mentioned there, having got to 87, of real disappointment. That, looking at your timeline of events, that was perhaps one of the first times that you had, maybe I'm using too strong a term, but sort of failed, if you like, in terms of what you were aiming to achieve. How did you manage that? How did you deal with that? You're a high-performing, high-achieving individual. Like, what was that experience like?
It was demoralizing, borderline humiliating. No, not humiliating, because I think the political side of it wasn't humiliating, because you could see that you were being swept by the tides of opinion and the continental drift of politics, if you like. It's also worth saying, I can't answer the question without talking about personal life. During this period, I'd happily married. We had our first son, James, and in the middle of the time when I was being politically successful and just got elected to the county council, we had a second son who at 3 months old died of a cot death. And when something like that happens, I think everything that happens afterwards, when one talks about failure, is seen in a slightly different perspective. But there were huge this is an awful loss, but at the same time, there are all kinds of learnings and reinforcements that come from it. Reinforcements about the way other human beings support you, about reinforcements about what's important in your life, recommitting to the most important relationship, your partnership, and to your existing children. And so failure has to be seen in that context. But back in the world of business, yes, if I compared myself with my father, who managed a successful career in business while campaigning for lots of other things as well, and I guess a lot of us do judge ourselves in that way, I found that hard to accept. That's absolutely right. Looking back now, I would say nothing succeeds like failure. I would say that the very things that I thought I'd been wasting my time on in terms of my potential business career, like writing those press releases and badgering those local authority officials, in what I ended up doing, they were all skills that were absolutely invaluable. The skill of setting up an organization where you don't have a lot of money, but your resources are your volunteers or are your underpaid employees. That, where the fuel is their commitment. All of that, I realized, these were lessons that I'd learned while I was, in inverted commas, failing.
That's such a and genuinely powerful message for a lot of our younger listeners, who we get to have really interesting senior people, about people that have ended up doing really interesting things with their careers coming on the show. And it never ceases to amaze me how many of our guests who, if you looked at their CV now, in their position now, you would, a lot of the younger people listening would be sort of wowed, if you like, and to the point of thinking, well, they just had the whole thing laid out and planned out from the very beginning, and it's clear that it was just step by step by step. But actually, most people talk about those points of failure, the learning through failure, the fact that they got to certain junctures in their careers and they didn't know exactly what to do. And even you describing that kind of slight conflict at play between your commercial, business, corporate career and your political career, and understanding that actually stay the course, stick with your convictions, and it might well present itself further down the line than you perhaps could even conceive of right now, that it's all going to package together correctly.
I think it's really important to understand that no experience is wasted. It may be a bad experience you're having, but no experience is wasted. And experience that at the time feels like bad experience, unproductive experience, has benefits that it's hard to anticipate. The other thing is that do be very careful not to look a gift horse in the mouth. On a couple of occasions I did. And in fact, I was so lucky because the big gift horse was after I joined the printing company. I had a call from a man called Charles Handy, who was chairman of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce. And he said, I think there's a job you could do for us here. And I turned him down. I said, I'm busy trying to make a success of this printing job. I think it would be irresponsible of me to leave it. And it was only when the printing company turned around to me about 3 months later and said they didn't think I was making a success of it and I might like to think about seeking an alternative form of employment, that I rang him up and I said, did you fill that post? And they hadn't. But honestly, that was a train that could well have left. And as things turned out, that was my big break. If offered these opportunities, it is worth getting outside whatever is your current comfort zone and talking to other people and examining them pretty closely.
And that's a super interesting point, Mark. There is that clear distinction, isn't there, between staying within your lane and staying within your comfort zone, as you described, and the discomfort associated with stepping outside of that. And this separate thing of saying, although it perhaps at times has been winding, and there have been pivots, and there have been, different sort of stages and various applications of your career. Ultimately, that commonality, if you like, of value and of perspective has sort of governed whatever that journey has been throughout your career. Would you agree that that's been the kind of common pathway throughout?
Yes, and I think the interesting thing is that sometimes I certainly allowed what my peers treated as the normal definition of success, the conventional definition of what a career should look like, to dominate over pursuing my values or my dreams. And I would say, be a pirate, be a rebel. If that's what it takes to reconnect with the real soul inside you, and I was very fortunate that even though I lacked the courage to do that on that pivotal occasion, I was given a second chance.
You are a podcaster's dream, Mark. Be a rebel, be a pirate. I think we've got our headline, our episode title. That was brilliant. So Mark, what happened next?
Well, I had the opportunity to work with Charles Handy, who asked the question in a lecture soon after I arrived, what is a company for? That gave me the lever to start asking other people in business leadership positions, what do you think a company is for? And that started an incredible debate, which then empowered me to get the RSA to think about an inquiry into the company of the tomorrow. We ran an inquiry into the company of tomorrow in the early 1990s, and blow me down, we found all these chief executives were willing to commit their company's time and money to the project, and they were all wanting to live the question. They were energized by the question. I learned from this process, by the way, that inside every chief executive there's a human being trying to climb out, and there was a kind of collective energy that we found ourselves creating, which led to the Tomorrow's Company report of 1995. And they then turned around to me and said, Mark, why don't you set up an organization? And I guess that was the moment when I did recognize the gift horse, and I didn't look in its mouth. And we set up Tomorrow's Company with some modest funding. If I was doing it again, I think I would have insisted at that moment of success that no, I want 10 times that amount of investment before we start. But we set up with some modest funding and bootstrapping a bit. And that's where we started as a Tomorrow's Company membership organization, which explored things like what's the future of company culture? How do companies better measure for the future? What does the reporting of the future look like?
And Mark, just on that. So, and I know we were trying to fit in, many years of what the Tomorrow's Company then went on to do. But if you were to just sort of give us a sense from 1995 up until the present day of kind of the key outcomes, the key achievements, if you like, of the organization, how would you sort of summarize the impact?
First, that we managed to achieve a change in directors' duties in the Companies Act and the 2006 Companies Act. There's still a lot of argument about it, but it mentions the fact that directors must have regard to the interests of employees and other stakeholders and the environment, and it talks about the long term, even though it still doesn't change the fact that it is the shareholders to whom the board are ultimately accountable. But in my view, you've got formal accountability and informal accountability. So that was one big achievement. The second big achievement was we started the whole stewardship revolution. We at the time that just before the financial crisis broke in 2008, we were working on a project called Tomorrow's Owners, where we were raising these questions about what is it to be an owner? And apart from having your responsibility to your beneficiaries, what about the stewardship responsibility of looking after the business so that the business is well positioned for the future? And the result of our work on that was that Sir David Walker, who did his report into what went wrong in the banks, said we need a stewardship code to go alongside the corporate governance code. And the first stewardship code in the UK was one we didn't think was that strong. It could have been stronger. But nonetheless, it was the precursor to stewardship codes all over the world, and to people all over the world saying, yes, investors need to be stewards, not simply traders of shares. And I think around those two very concrete achievements, what we saw was a change in culture around a commitment by some, not all directors, to make long-termism serious, and a commitment to say that business is about human beings. And if we make our business about human beings, we can do so in a way that makes it more profitable and successful. So that, I would say, was the impact.
Hear, Mark. I give out hears for guests that I think have stated something that's very much worthy of that, and that's fantastic to hear about the work that you guys have done at Tomorrow's Company so far. I know at the end of our conversation we're going to touch upon some of your most recent initiatives, but that's a really fascinating insight for now. Brilliantly, as you can see, we've absolutely obliterated our 20 minutes talking about you. I could go on and ask you many more questions, but I want to ask you, it's sort of tying two questions together. I want our audience to really understand Tomorrow's Company and what you're trying to achieve there. But I'd like to frame it in a question to you of, I'm thinking about your career from today, presumably sort of leveraging the impact that Tomorrow's Company can achieve. What would success at the end of your career look like?
The definition of success from here is very much a new pasture and a new pathway. We spent in Tomorrow's Company, we spent best part of 2.5 decades getting the human purposes of business, the importance of purpose, values, and relationships seen as the essence of business success, not seen as the alternative track of being responsible while making money, but actually human business being effective business. Now, looking around today, the word purpose now gets honored with a capital P, and words purposeful get injected with huge amounts of meaning that they never had 30 years ago. And I'd like to think we Tomorrow's Company had a big part in making that the case. What we now feel in Tomorrow's Company is the challenge, is actually the next generation. And we're back to this issue of how does the 14, 15-year-old or younger start to engage with the possibilities of what they might do with their life in a way that is true to them as an individual. And this is why we've always had the educational audience as one of the 4 audiences of Tomorrow's Company. Tomorrow's Company, in our early days, we always talked about business leaders, one audience, investors, another, the government and the wider community, a third, and the fourth was always the education process. How are people understanding business from the way they're being taught? Well, today, Tomorrow's Company is embarked on a program of working in academies and schools. We are starting, and we're very near the start, to say to those 14, 15-year-olds, let's have a look at you. What's your potential? Because so much of school is organized around a kind of factory version of knowledge collection. You've got to pass these exams. The items we've put into the school program are about, getting the youngster to think about themselves, and what their individual potential is, but B, then challenging them to come up with business ideas or solutions, giving them the skills to start to do planning, communication, presentation, teamwork, problem solving, and then introducing them to local employers and organizations where they can start to get a taste of the real workplace and where they might fit within it. So it's the last 2 or 3 years, which again has to some extent been the result of failure in coming to the end of a certain lifetime of work in the original Tomorrow's Company. The last 2 years have been about reinvention.
And brilliantly, and I love bringing this sort of section to a close, comes full circle back to your own personal experience all those years ago when you were going and experiencing your own experience of community service sandwiched between sort of educational hops, if you like, and how impactful that was for you in terms of that realization of the practical impact that you could have on the world around you. For those of our listeners and viewers who want to check out Tomorrow's Company, we'll obviously link to all of the various materials. We'll share links to Mark's LinkedIn as well, so you guys can check out the full scope of Mark's career. But thank you for being so open, Mark, and giving us such an interesting insight into your background. Moving forward now, would you mind providing our listeners with a bit of an overview and summary of, I think it was Leah Smith's article in Food Bev Media from March this year, regarding Ben & Jerry's and their relationship with Unilever. Would you mind providing just a bit of a summary synopsis, if you like, and then just picking out whatever for you were the most interesting points from the piece?
Yes. The Ben & Jerry's story, it seems to me, is quite a parable of the issues that we face in seeking to move towards responsible business. Many people will be aware of Ben & Jerry's, a campaigning company producing what I think many of us would feel is great ice cream, marketing it very originally and identifying itself very strongly with campaigns which go beyond the worlds of climate change, of environment, of low wages, and very much into the world of politics and into, for example, the Israel-Palestine conflict. And so, first of all, what was so interesting was Ben & Jerry's is an independent company doing all those things with its founders very much in charge, with the financial support that they're getting from investors very much obtained on the basis that people know what they're buying into with Ben & Jerry's. Then you have them, they decide to sell the company to Unilever. Now, the moment they decide to sell the company to Unilever, the question is, they are no longer in control in the same way. Unilever, one of the world's largest conglomerates, making everything from margarine to soap, and tea and all steps in between. It's suddenly going to be a different proposition. So they write into their constitution that point, and into the agreement when they sell the company, protective clauses which say, you're buying Ben & Jerry's, but you're not going to change the character of Ben & Jerry's. We're still going to be this campaigning organization. And what has happened most recently is that this has started to unravel. And the chief executive of Ben & Jerry's has been removed, and the Ben & Jerry's originals, makes it sound like one of their ice creams. The Ben & true believers are saying, you've only done this because this guy has actually been true to our values. And it raises all the questions about, is it ever possible, if you surrender the ownership of a business, is it ever possible to kind of build walls around that business such that you can continue to maintain the principles by which you'd like to do business? And brings into full focus for me the whole question that ownership really matters. The idea that you can talk about a purposeful company independent of talking about, well, who are the owners, and B, under the ownership structure, who might be the owners, is for the birds. And what I've seen this so many times. I mean, years and years ago, I remember having this conversation with Sir Adrian Cadbury, who was of the original Cadbury family, and he was himself famous for the Cadbury Code in corporate governance. And he was a great statesman of a business leader, a wonderful man, and a great positive influence. But I remember asking him, why did the Cadbury Schweppes company decide? Why did the family ultimately decide to turn Cadbury, which was a family-owned business, into a listed company? And didn't they realize when they were doing so that they were surrendering control over many of those Quaker values that they live by? And his answer really was that we didn't have a choice, that you reach a point when a company is so big that it isn't possible to finance the capital as a family, particularly as one generation succeeds the next. And I think one of the issues it then raises is that there's a real gap in the capital markets for the kind of owners who will actually align themselves with the values of a Cadbury's or a Ben and Jerry's. And I think one of the areas of innovation that we we are seeing some of, but we most need, is that it should become more possible for people with their savings to put their capital and their pensions and so on into portfolios where at least some, if not all, of that portfolio can be invested in companies which share their values. Unilever is probably one of the most human of the big conglomerates, and certainly under the leadership of Paul Polman, one of its previous chief executives. It was a model of championing sustainability. But Paul Polman went, and a new chief executive came, and people on the investment register of Unilever changed, and the agenda changed. And it seems to me that it's important to ask ourselves what we can learn from this.
For me, the thing, there were so many points in what you described there, Mark, but just taking it back to this particular case, the thing that struck me is that it's all good and well making a decision and putting all of these, sort of protections in place, if you like, when you sell a company in the year 2000. But realistically, Unilever, as you say, is an entity and an organization where people change and strategies evolve and ways of working evolve as well. And it was always going to be that, 20, 25 years down the road, that things were going to evolve and change, and the goalposts were going to shift. Do we need, as founders of purpose-driven organizations, do we need to wise up and be a bit more realistic that perhaps even if we sell at this stage and we have these protections in place, the reality is that those are going to be, cannibalized. They're going to be dismissed at some point in the future? Or is that sort of slightly pessimistic thinking around why or how you'd go about managing the sale of a business like this?
I think it needs thinking about in advance. I think that it's a human failing, which is, of course, one of the reasons we are in the climate crisis we're in, that we're very bad at thinking into the future and thinking about the consequences of our action or inaction now for the next generation. Well, if you apply that to business, I think there are people who have found a way of dealing with this. There are people who have firmly decided that they are going to instill a form of ownership which it may limit the growth of the business, but it also underpins the values of the business. I mean, to give you a small example, the founder of a business whose foundation has been incredibly important for tomorrow's company is a man called Peter Ward, who founded a strategic consultancy called Telos Partners, which has now been going for 25 years. He created a foundation all those years ago, and the future of Telos Partners after the founder has gone is very much in the hands of a foundation. It's not in the hands of anybody who could make an opportunistic sale. And many other people have gone. Julian Richer went the employee ownership route. Julian Richer didn't have any children. So in a sense, the family business route wasn't open to him, or as he put it, I don't have any spoiled children to inherit my business. And he's created the employee ownership model. There are all kinds of hybrids. There are, in my part of the world, a business that's been very supportive of tomorrow's company in the past, Adnams, the brewers, is a hybrid between family ownership, employee and management ownership, and it's listed on one of the smaller city exchanges. That's another model. You get into this question about anchor shareholders. If you have enough if you have a 20% holding by one institution, which has a certain set of values and commitments, the other 80% to some extent is less relevant because the 20% can have an influence. The other issue, it seems to me, is something tomorrow's company championed in all our work on good corporate governance, is the idea of the board mandate. Now, the idea of the board mandate is that the board sits down and says, right, who's put us here? What is our boundary of authority? Let's define it. And whoever you are, if you're a listed company and you've got thousands of different shareholders, if you've actually sat down and said to those shareholders, if you're investing in this business, here's the mandate. Here is the defined view of what you've invested in. It's not a complete protection against shifts in the capital markets, but it is at least a source of clarity about where the business is going.
So the key with this is to progress as a purpose-driven leader, founder, etc. of a business. Is just to be realistic about the way that you need to protect your business long term, and that's the key. The key headline is to not think too idealistically about how you might be the change, if you like. You've got to plan for these influences, if you like, later on down the line. Is that a fair synopsis?
Yeah. Another way of putting it would be to say, you remember the great Shakespeare speech, is it in As You Like It, about the 7 ages of man?
Go on.
And so, you have the mewling infant, and you end up with the ancient old guy who's kind of stumbling around and practically back to the mewling infant. But the point of the 7 ages of the company is that if we realize as human beings that we're going to be that stumbling old man one day, and then we're ultimately going to be gone. If, as a company, we think about the fact that there will be these stages, and we think ahead a little bit about it, and when people accept that first bit of finance, are they thinking about the control they may be surrendering at that point? Because it may not seem at the time that they are surrendering control, but it can well end up like that. I was listening this week to a program about the Beatles, And when they created a company so that they thought they would create the company so that they could avoid all the 98% tax on the sales from their songs. But what they ended up doing was surrendering control over their own intellectual property because they hadn't thought through what this means. So I think, yes, the advice is think of companies as having lots of stages. Think of the 7 ages of the company.
Mark, that was brilliant and a very good sort of, I think, practical, strategic point for any organization or any leader out there who is pondering the kind of future of their business. Let's move on now. I know you and I wanted to spend a little bit more time on the magic wand, and you have been given special dispensation, Mark, to use the magic wand on for multiple suggestions. No one else has ever been allowed to do this. You are the first. But let me ask you the question directly, and then you can sort of kick off with it. Mark, if I was to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that? Well, I'm going to say one. What would be the things that you would look to change?
Right. But so let me, before I become the rebel and the pirate, let me start with a disciplined one thing.
Okay.
My one thing relates to the way the government spends its money on companies. Because if you think about the vision of the company, as we in Tomorrow's Company have always defined it, as a company with strong purpose, strong values, good governance that makes sure that the values aren't just words, they are actually upheld in the actions, measurement systems that actually ensure, monitoring systems that actually ensure the company behaves as it said it would behave, a good culture of challenge and so on. If we want to create more companies like that, purposeful companies, if you like, in today's language, then surely if we've got somebody spending 350 plus billion pounds a year of taxpayers' money on companies, it's a good idea to define the character of the kind of companies we want to invest in and use the purchasing power of the taxpayer to steer companies in that direction, which A, says to the world of business, you're more likely to get this business if you behave like this and or organize like this, and B, experience tells us that you'll get less infected blood scandals, less bad PPE, and less appalling Grenfell Tower type safety abuses, because you're dealing with companies of good character. And by the way, 10 years ago in Tomorrow's Company, having come up with the idea, we were able to develop with a group that I chaired for the British Standards Institution, a standard which I call the trust test, which is all about how do you monitor corporate. How do you get a company to demonstrate to you before you're buying from it that it has these qualities? So my magic wand, my personal selfish magic wand idea is that.
And Mark, you mentioned that was brought into play, or you worked on that 10 years ago. What happened with it?
What happened with it is that it hasn't had wide take up. I think I was rather expecting that the British Standards Institution would market it more effectively. I haven't been able to market it effectively, but what we have managed to do now is we've now started a debate which I believe will lead to fulfilling its potential, because if you look at the 5 missions of the current government, they talk very strongly about the need for joining up between the missions. They talk very strongly about value for money. We now have a new Procurement Act. We now have, in the new Procurement Act, the debarment of those companies which have in some ways disgraced themselves. And there's going to be an obvious need, and I've even had conversations with people in the Cabinet Office who've confirmed there is going to be an obvious need. Say, well, how do you how does a company navigate its way back from the naughty step? Well, something like this standard, not in isolation, but something based on the principles of this standard would be a way of doing this. But I would also say that this is highly relevant to why people are having their doubts and challenges about something like the B Corp certificate. Because although there are great things about B Corp and the B Corp movement, I have always been critical of the way in which B Corp defines governance. I haven't, to be honest, looked at the new B Corp standard closely enough to judge whether it is greatly improved. But the importance of seeing governance not simply as, have we got the right mix of faces on the board, but the importance of seeing governance as, in Tomorrow's Company, we always talked about the virtuous circle of governance. You set your purpose, you set your values, you work out what your key relationships are, and after that, the virtuous circle is about measuring accordingly, rewarding accordingly, reporting accordingly, monitoring behavior accordingly, so that your purpose and your values live in all your relationships. And that, to me, is that methodology of governance is just central to whether we're going to get the kind of businesses that are responsible, and by the way, the kind of businesses that wouldn't allow themselves to indulge in flaky greenwash.
And ultimately, therefore, the businesses of tomorrow that are going to be successful. And that's a key component of the work that you're doing as well, Mark. Now, Mark, that was brilliant. That was a fantastic suggestion. One that seems, again, it just seems like the magic wand at times is used for things that you think, of course, that seems totally reasonable. That seems like a totally sensible suggestion. So great to have highlighted that. You did, though, want to also, at this magic wand kind of point, just reflect on or introduce a new initiative that you're working on at Tomorrow's Company, and perhaps encourage some of our listeners and viewers to get involved. So over to you. Just explain a little bit more about what you guys are doing.
Thank you for indulging the rebel. Yes, Tomorrow's Company has been working with a growing group of responsible business organizations, and we've started to gather together to ask ourselves, the original question we asked ourselves was this question about which companies should we buy from, work for, and invest in. And so the implicit question is, and so how do you define the difference between the good, the bad, and the ugly? And then that discussion, which has involved all kinds of organizations, including B Corp, including business in the community, including Responsible 100, including Planet Mark, Good Business Charter, and so on. That has now developed because of something that Andrew Griffiths of Planet Mark suggested, into a search for these game-changing ideas. And together with Michael Solomon of Responsible 100, at the recent Anthropy conference down at the Eden Project, we had started a process which is now open to anybody to join in, of saying, we want to collect your game-changing ideas, because we want a portfolio of game-changing ideas, because maybe from that process we can develop a dialogue about how we might distill the essence of what we need to do to change our system of wealth creation. People like you, Charlie, people like many of you, of our listeners here, will be feeling frustration that they are working conscientiously in their own space, but there are blockers in the system that are stopping them achieving what they might achieve. Well, isn't it a good idea to bring the people who are working in those ways together to say, well, let's think about those blockers. So, for example, some people have been suggesting legislation. Is it the Nature and Climate legislation? Is it a Better Business Act? There are other legislative suggestions. Some people have talked about place-based investment being the absolute key to the future. But the point is to have a place where we are truly starting to create a dialogue about change at the level of the system.
Mark, it's absolutely brilliant. And we will share links to various resources, etc., for, again, listeners and viewers to check this out. I think I actually was at Anthropy myself last week. I didn't get a chance to catch up with you there. But,
I'm sorry I missed you. Yeah.
No, I should have mentioned that I was there. But it sounds like the perfect environment to be doing this sort of initiative. Fantastic event, and really had that kind of sense of thinking about the things that we can do to really shift the dial and to change things from a systems perspective. So fantastic to hear, Mark. Mark, thank you so much for joining us this morning. That has been an absolute whistle-stop tour, I know, and I feel like you and I could talk on for hours and hours, but we'll leave it there for today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And that's it for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big thank you to Mark Goyder, founder of Tomorrow's Company and longtime advocate for enlightened corporate leadership, for joining me for today's show. In this episode, we explored the recent controversy surrounding Ben & Jerry's and its parent company Unilever, an unfolding case that poses powerful questions about the role of corporate activism, the tension between profit and purpose, and who truly gets to define a company's mission. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by the Entrepreneur's Charter, championing responsible sustainability communications. Visit entrepreneurscharter.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.